She was humiliated, rejected, invisible in that wealthy household. On Christmas Eve she cried softly, but he heard her. The most powerful man in the mansion entered her room, and there a forbidden romance began. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end, and you won't regret it. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're listening to this beautiful story from. Let's continue. The sound of crystal glasses echoed through the corridors of Ashworth Manor, like small bells announcing a party Clara Evans would never be a part of. It was Christmas Eve in Manchester, and the fine rain falling on the gardens of the city's affluent suburb created a melancholy melody against the French windows. Clara adjusted her white apron for the third time that morning, her fingers trembling slightly, as she checked that every pleat was in its proper place. At 24, she had learned that invisibility was her greatest protection. The manor was a monument to power and tradition, built at the beginning of the last century by British industrialists who had made their fortune in textiles. The Ashworth residence looked like a museum, where every piece of furniture told a story of generations of wealth and influence. The walls, covered in wallpaper imported from France, held portraits of stern-faced ancestors, as if they were judging every movement of those who dared to step on the Italian marble floors. Clara knew every inch of that house. She had arrived there 6 months ago, recommended by a nun from the orphanage where she had grown up. An orphan since the age of 5, she carried only a small suitcase and a faded photograph of her mother when she first passed through the wrought-iron gate that protected the property. She didn't know then that the time-yellowed image held secrets that would one day shake the foundations of that traditional family. Working as a housemaid was nothing new to Clara. Since she was 16, when she left the foster care system, she had worked in the homes of Manchester's elite, always discreet, always efficient, always invisible. That was exactly how she preferred it. The trauma she carried like an invisible scar on her chest had taught her that staying in the shadows was safer. No one bothered her when she was just another ghost circulating through the silent rooms. But Ashworth Manor had something different, a sadness that permeated the walls like an old perfume. The house still mourned the death of Vivian Ashworth, the lady of the house who had died 2 years earlier in a tragic fire during a trip to Paris. Since then, the patriarch, Arthur, had become a shadow of his former self, a man who fulfilled his social and business obligations with the precision of a clock, but seemed to have lost any trace of joy. Clara watched him from a distance during her chores. Arthur Ashworth, at 39, was still an impressive man. Tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair with a few silver streaks at his temples, he had the kind of presence that commanded respect without needing to say a word. His green eyes carried a melancholy that Clara recognized all too well. It was the same one she saw in the mirror every morning. He treated the staff with formal but distant politeness. He never shouted, never showed impatience, but he also never smiled. It was as if he had built an invisible wall around himself, keeping the world at a safe distance. Clara respected that barrier. She understood the need for protection better than anyone. Christmas night arrived with an elegant party that transformed the manor into a somber fairy tale scene. Guests dressed in their finest clothes circulated through the drawing rooms, their voices mingling with the sound of the grand piano that dominated the main hall. Clara had helped prepare everything: the flowers imported from Ecuador, the silver cutlery polished to a mirror-like shine, the canapés prepared by the French chef hired especially for the occasion. When the last guest had arrived and the party reached its peak, Clara was finally able to retreat to her quarters. The maid's room was on the 3rd floor, a small but clean space with a single bed, a simple wardrobe and a window overlooking the back of the property. It was there that she found her only privacy, away from the gazes and judgments of the outside world. Mrs. Amelia, the housekeeper, had allowed all the staff to spend Christmas with their families. Everyone except Clara. "Someone needs to stay and look after the house," the austere woman had said, without looking directly at the young woman. Clara didn't mind. She had no family waiting for her anywhere. For her, Christmas had always been just another day on the calendar. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Clara held the photograph of her mother in her hands. The image showed a young woman with a shy smile and kind eyes, dressed in a housemaid's uniform. On the back, delicate handwriting said only Maria Evans, 1975. It was all Clara had of her origins, the only proof that someone had once loved her unconditionally. Memories of the orphanage always returned in moments of solitude, especially the memory she tried to suppress every day. Mark, the staff member who was supposed to protect her, but who at 16 had destroyed her innocence on a night she preferred to forget. The trauma had shaped her personality like a branding iron sears the skin. Clara had learned not to trust, not to give herself over, to always keep a safe distance from anyone who could hurt her. It was then that the tears began to fall. First one, then another, until they turned into a silent cry that she muffled against the pillow so no one would hear. It was always like this at Christmas. The date that was supposed to celebrate love and togetherness only highlighted her profound loneliness. Clara cried for all the hugs she never received, for all the lullabies she never heard, for all the Christmases she spent alone, wishing she had someone who cared about her. What she didn't know was that, on the other side of the solid wood door, someone had stopped in the hallway. Arthur had gone up to the 3rd floor to check that everything was in order after the party. It was a ritual of his, a way of maintaining control over every aspect of his property. But as he passed Clara's room, the muffled sound of crying made him stop. For a moment he stood motionless, his hand suspended in the air, unsure whether to knock or simply move on. The sound touched something deep in his memory. His own mother used to cry like that when he was a child, thinking no one could hear her. Eleanor Ashworth had been a fragile woman, crushed by the weight of social expectations and her husband's coldness. Arthur had grown up listening to those silent cries and vowing he would never cause that kind of pain to anyone. Something compelled him to knock lightly on the door. 3 soft taps, almost a whisper. Clara was startled, quickly wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. Who could be there at this hour? All the guests had left, and the staff had no reason to come up to the 3rd floor. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice still trembling. "It's me, Arthur," said the voice from outside, softer than she had ever heard it. "May I come in?" Clara hesitated. She had never been alone with her employer, never had a conversation that went beyond yes, sir, and no. "Sir?" But there was something in his voice that sounded different, almost vulnerable. "One moment," she said, quickly getting up to fix her hair and check that her face showed no signs of crying. When she opened the door, she found Arthur standing in the hallway, still dressed in his dark suit from the party, but with his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. He looked different under the dim light of the corridor, less imposing and more human. "I heard," he began, but stopped as if he didn't know how to continue. "Is everything all right?" Clara lowered her eyes, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes, sir. I apologize if I disturbed you. I didn't know anyone was still awake." Arthur glanced at the small room behind her. The simple bed, the modest wardrobe, the photograph she still held in her hand. Suddenly he realized how lonely it must be for a young woman of Clara's age to spend Christmas completely alone. "You didn't disturb me," he said gently. "In fact, I couldn't sleep either." There was a moment of awkward silence. Clara didn't know whether to invite him in or wait for him to leave. Arthur seemed to be struggling with some internal dilemma. "May I?" he asked, gesturing towards the inside of the room. Clara nodded, opening the door a little wider. Arthur entered slowly, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. The room seemed even smaller with his presence, but somehow it didn't bother her as much as she had expected. He noticed the photograph in her hands. "Your mother?" he asked. Clara nodded, offering him the picture so he could see. "It's the only thing I have of her. Maria Evans. She died when I was 5. Arthur studied the photograph intently, and for a moment Clara thought she saw something like recognition in his eyes. But it was so fleeting that she thought she had imagined it. "She was beautiful," he said, handing the photo back. "You look like her." Clara felt a warmth spread up her neck. She wasn't used to receiving compliments, especially from someone like Arthur Ashworth. "Thank you," she murmured. They stood in silence for a few minutes, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was as if they were both recognizing something in the other, a shared pain that needed no words to be understood. "I don't like Christmas either," Arthur said suddenly, surprising himself with the confession. Since Vivian died, these holidays only served to highlight the emptiness. Clara looked at him in surprise. It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife in front of her, the first time he had shown any trace of vulnerability. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. Arthur nodded, looking out the small bedroom window. Sometimes I think the pain will never go away, that I'll carry this guilt forever. Guilt? Clara asked before she could stop herself. He looked at her and she saw a depth of suffering in his green eyes that took her breath away. I wasn't there when she died, he said. We had argued before the trip. She went to Paris alone, angry with me. If I had gone with her, maybe. Clara felt a pang of compassion that surprised her. Without thinking, she reached out and lightly touched his arm. It was just a brief touch, but they both felt the electricity that passed between them. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. Accidents happen. Life is sometimes cruel for no reason. Arthur looked down at her hand, which was still resting on his arm. It was the first time in 2 years that someone had touched him with genuine compassion, without ulterior motives or interest in his fortune. How do you do it? He asked. Living alone, without family, without anyone? How do you bear it? Clara withdrew her hand but kept her gaze steady on him. You learn to survive, she said. When you have no choice, you discover you're stronger than you thought. Arthur saw in her something he had lost, resilience, courage, a quiet determination that impressed him. Clara was not just a housemaid. She was a woman who had faced adversities he couldn't even imagine, and yet remained standing. You shouldn't be alone on Christmas night, he said. Clara gave a sad smile. I'm used to it. In fact, I prefer it this way. It's more peaceful. But Arthur saw through the gentle lie. He saw the loneliness she tried to hide, the same loneliness he carried like a weight on his chest every day. How about... He hesitated, as if about to cross a line that shouldn't be crossed. How about we go downstairs for a cup of tea? The house is empty, the guests are gone. We can talk a little more. Clara looked at him in surprise. It was the first time anyone had invited her to do something. The first time she felt her company was desired. I don't know if that would be appropriate. Sir, she said, but her voice betrayed her desire to accept. Arthur, he said. You can call me Arthur. And as for what's appropriate, he gave a sad smile. I think we're past that point, since I decided to knock on your door in the middle of the night. Clara felt something stir inside her chest, like a flower trying to bloom through concrete. It had been so long since she had felt that strange sensation of hope. All right, she said finally. But just one cup of tea. They walked down the marble staircase together, their footsteps echoing softly through the silent corridors. The manor seemed different in the quiet of the early morning, less imposing and more welcoming. In the kitchen, Clara prepared chamomile tea while Arthur sat at the wooden table where the staff had their meals. It was surreal to see the master of the house in that simple space, drinking tea from an ordinary cup like any normal person. They talked for over an hour about small things, books they liked to read, places they dreamed of visiting, childhood memories that didn't hurt too much to share. When Clara finally returned to her room, it was past 3 in the morning. Lying in bed, she looked up at the ceiling and tried to process what had happened. For the first time in years, Christmas hadn't just been about loneliness and painful memories. It had been about human connection, about finding someone who understood pain without needing explanations. On the other side of the manor, in his master suite, Arthur was also awake, staring at the ornate ceiling of his room. He couldn't get Clara out of his head. The kindness in her eyes, the quiet strength she carried, the way she had touched his arm with such natural compassion. For the first time since Vivian's death, he felt something other than just pain or guilt. It was a strange and frightening sensation, as if he were waking from a deep sleep. Neither of them knew that Christmas night had planted the seed of something that would grow and become more powerful than either could imagine. Something that would challenge social conventions, unearth secrets from the past, and test the limits of how much two people can love, despite all the circumstances that conspire to keep them apart. The morning arrived with sun breaking through the clouds, as if time itself were trying to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there was hope even for hearts that thought they had stopped dreaming. The days following Christmas were different at Ashworth Manor. A subtle energy had shifted, as if the air had become less heavy, more charged with possibilities. Clara noticed it first in the small details. The silk scarf left discreetly on the mantelpiece in the drawing room where she cleaned, with a small note that said only, "For the cold days." The book of Christina Rossetti's poetry she found on her table in the kitchen, without a dedication, but with a few pages marked, the special coffee that began to appear in the pantry. The same kind they had shared on that night of conversation. Arthur didn't speak directly about these gestures, maintaining the daytime formality that social conventions required. But Clara saw it in the glances that lasted a second too long, in the way he slowed his pace when he passed her in the corridors, in the way his voice became slightly softer when he addressed her. It was as if they had created a silent language, made of small cares and attentions that no one else noticed. The January afternoons brought the typical heat of an English summer, and with it, a different routine in the house. Mrs. Amelia had travelled to visit a sick sister in Liverpool, leaving Clara in charge of supervising the cleaning and organisation of the manor. It was the first time she had full access to the house, including the rooms that normally remained locked. It was during one of these lonely afternoons that Clara made the discovery that would change everything. Arthur's private study was on the second floor, in a room with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books on business, history and literature. The windows overlooked the back gardens, where the hydrangeas planted by Vivian still bloomed in shades of blue and pink. Clara was dusting the shelves when she noticed that one section of the bookcase looked different, as if it had been moved recently. Curious, she examined it more closely and discovered that some of the books were fake, concealing a secret compartment. Inside she found something that made her heart race, a diary bound in brown leather, with the initials VA engraved in gold on the cover. Vivian Ashworth's diary. Clara knew she shouldn't open it, that she was violating a dead woman's privacy and trespassing on territory that was not hers. But something stronger than reason compelled her to open the notebook to the first page. Vivian's elegant slanted handwriting leaped out at her like a posthumous confession. March 15th, 2020. Arthur came home late again. He says it's business, always business. But I know he's running from me, running from us. Our marriage has become a stage play for Manchester society. We smile in photos, dance at parties, but at home we are two strangers sharing the same roof. Clara turned the pages, absorbing every word as if it were an addiction. Vivian wrote about the loneliness within her marriage, about the social expectations that suffocated her, about how she felt like a prisoner of a name and a reputation. But there was something else in the pages, something that sent a chill down Clara's spine. October 2nd, 2020. I've started noticing strange things. Someone has been going through my belongings. I've found drawers rummaged through, papers out of place. When I ask the staff, they all deny it. Is it my paranoia? Or is someone really watching me? December 15th, 2020. I've met someone. I can't write his name here, in case someone finds this diary. But for the first time in years, I feel alive. He listens to me, sees me as a woman, not just as Arthur Ashworth's wife. It's dangerous, I know, but the heart doesn't obey reason. Clara swallowed hard. Vivian had a lover, the perfect woman, the exemplary wife everyone venerated, had secrets that could shake the foundations of the Ashworth reputation. The following pages described clandestine meetings, the guilt Vivian carried, but also the happiness she had found. She wrote of plans to ask for a divorce, to start a new life away from social constraints. But she also mentioned fear, a growing sense that she was being watched, threatened. The last entry in the diary was dated 2 days before the fatal trip to Paris. January 18th, 2021. I can't stand this farce any longer. I'm going to tell Arthur everything when he gets back from the business trip. He deserves to know the truth, even if it destroys our life in society. Maybe then we can both be free. I'm scared of what might happen, but I can't live this lie anymore. The diary ended there abruptly, like a song cut off in the middle of its melody. Clara closed the notebook, her hands trembling. If Vivian had really confessed the affair to Arthur before she died, it changed everything about the version of the story she knew. The argument before the trip, the guilt he carried, it all made sense now. But before she could fully process what she had read, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly, she put the diary back in the secret compartment and returned to her dusting, her heart beating so loudly she was sure she would be discovered. "Clara?" Arthur's voice echoed through the room. He appeared at the study door, still dressed in the suit he had worn for a business meeting. "Sorry to disturb you. I need to get some documents." "Of course, sir," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just finishing up here." Arthur headed to his desk, but stopped when he noticed Clara seemed different. There was something in her eyes, a turmoil that wasn't there before. Is everything... Hands where they shouldn't have been. The pain that made her bleed for days. The humiliation of having no one to turn to, because no one would believe an orphan's word against that of a respected staff member. "Excuse me," she murmured, trying to pull away. But Mark held her arm with more force than necessary. "Not so fast," he said quietly, so no one else could hear. "I think we have a lot to talk about. About the old days, about certain letters you wrote back then. Letters I've kept all these years." Clara's blood turned to ice. She remembered the letters. In her naive, traumatized teenage mind, she had written letters to Mark after the abuse, confused letters where she apologized, where she begged him not to tell anyone what had happened, where she took the blame for what he had done to her. At the time, she thought that if she were good and obedient, he would leave her alone. "Very interesting letters," Mark continued, still wearing that cruel smile, "especially for a traditional family like the Ashworths. I wonder what the master would think if he knew his housemaid has such a colorful past." Clara violently wrenched her arm free. "You have no right to—" "I have a right to protect my reputation," Mark interrupted. "And you, girl, have always been very good at protecting my reputation, haven't you? I suggest you continue to be." Before Clara could respond, Arthur appeared in the hallway. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, noticing the tension in the air. "No problem at all, Mr. Ashworth," Mark said quickly, his tone becoming respectful again. "I was just getting to know the team better. Clara and I discovered we have mutual acquaintances." Arthur looked from one to the other, sensing something was wrong but unable to pinpoint what it was. Clara was as pale as a ghost, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Clara, are you all right?" he asked with genuine concern. "Yes, sir, I am," she lied. "Just a bit tired from the heat." Mark watched the interaction with renewed interest. There was something there in the way the master looked at the maid, in the concern in his voice, valuable information that could be used at the right time. "If you'll excuse me," Mark said with false deference, "I'll go put my things in the staff quarters." As he walked away, Arthur moved closer to Clara. "Are you sure you're all right? You seem shaken." Clara fought the urge to collapse into his arms and tell him everything, but Mark's threats echoed in her mind. If he showed those letters to Arthur, how could she explain? How could she make someone understand that a victim of abuse sometimes writes things that don't make sense, takes on blame that isn't theirs, begs for forgiveness for crimes committed against them? "I'm fine," she repeated, "just surprised to run into someone from my past." "I wasn't expecting it." Arthur nodded, but Clara could see he wasn't convinced. There were questions in his eyes, a curiosity she didn't know how to satisfy without destroying everything between them. "If you need to talk about anything," he said softly, "you know where to find me." In the days that followed, Mark's presence in the manor became a constant torment for Clara. He seemed to be always nearby, always watching, always subtly reminding her of the power he held over her. During meals in the staff kitchen, he would tell stories from the orphanage, carefully edited to paint Clara as a troubled teenager and himself as a dedicated employee trying to help. "Clara was always a complicated girl," he would say to Mrs. Amelia, who absorbed every word with growing interest. "Very imaginative, made up fantastic stories to get attention. Sometimes I felt sorry for her, tried to be kind, but she took everything the wrong way." Amelia listened to it all with that cold smile that never reached her eyes. Every piece of information about Clara's dubious past was like gold for her plans. The housekeeper had dedicated her life to protecting the Ashworth reputation and would not allow an opportunistic maid to destroy the family's legacy. The relationship between Clara and Arthur, which had begun to blossom, was now being suffocated by the constant tension. Clara had withdrawn again, avoiding being alone with him, responding to his attempts at closeness with polite but distant monosyllables. Arthur didn't understand the sudden change, the way she had reverted to being the silent ghost she was when she first arrived. One night, unable to bear the distance between them any longer, Arthur went up to the 3rd floor. He found Clara on the small service terrace, hanging laundry on the line under the light of the full moon. She was wearing a simple white cotton dress that the night wind molded to her body, and for a moment he was breathless at her natural beauty. "Clara," he said softly, so as not to startle her, She turned and he saw that she had been crying. "Mr. Ashworth, I didn't hear you come up." "Why are you avoiding me?" he asked directly. "What happened?" Clara held a wet shirt in her hands, using it as a shield between them. "Nothing happened. It's just... Maybe it's better if we keep things as they were before." "As they were before?" Arthur stepped closer, ignoring the imaginary barrier she had created. "You mean when we were two strangers living in the same house, pretending the other didn't exist?" "It was safer that way," she murmured. "Safer for whom?" Arthur was very close now, so close that Clara could feel the warmth of his body. "For me, who was slowly dying of loneliness, or for you, who hides behind aprons and excuses so you don't have to face what you're feeling." Clara let out a sob. "You don't understand. There are things in my past, things that if you knew would completely change your opinion of me." Arthur cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "It doesn't matter," he said firmly. "It doesn't matter what happened before. What matters is what exists between us now." "But it does matter," she said desperately. "To people like Mrs. Amelia, to society, to your family. I'm nothing more than a housemaid with a questionable past. I'm not worthy of—" "Don't finish that sentence," Arthur interrupted. "You are worthy of everything. Of respect, of affection, of love." The last word hung in the air between them like a confession. It was the first time either of them had mentioned that word, and its weight was almost palpable. "Love," Clara repeated, as if testing the sound of the word. "I don't even know what that means." "Then let me show you," Arthur said, moving even closer. When his lips touched hers, Clara felt as if the world stopped spinning. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid of breaking her. But when she responded, when her hands gripped his shirt as if it were an anchor in a storm, the kiss deepened, filled with all the pain, loneliness, and desire they had both held back for so long. It was the first real kiss of Clara's life. The first that wasn't stolen or forced. The first that came from a place of choice and not of power. She lost herself in the sensation, in the way Arthur held her as if she were precious, in the way he whispered her name like a prayer. When they parted, they were both breathless. Clara rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed, trying to memorize that moment before reality invaded her life again. "I love you," Arthur said quietly. "No matter what happens, no matter who tries to separate us. I love you." Clara opened her eyes and saw in his a truth that made her believe for the first time that maybe she deserved to be loved. "I love you too," she whispered. "And that's why I'm so afraid." They didn't know that 3 floors below, Mrs. Amelia was watching everything through a pair of binoculars from her bedroom window. The housekeeper had long suspected something was going on between her master and the orphan maid, but now she had the confirmation she needed. Beside her, Mark was finishing his distorted version of Clara's story at the orphanage, painting her as a seductive and manipulative teenager who had tried to ruin his career with false accusations. "Interesting," Amelia murmured, lowering the binoculars. "Very interesting indeed." Her plan was taking shape. First, she would contact the family matriarch, Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, Arthur's mother, who lived in a grand house in the Cotswolds. The old woman was fierce in protecting the family name and would not tolerate her son getting involved with a housemaid of dubious reputation. Next, she would use the information Mark had provided to destroy any credibility Clara might have. The letters the man kept would be the perfect ammunition for a quiet but effective smear campaign. And finally, when Clara was completely isolated and discredited, it would be easy to convince Arthur that he had been deceived by a skilled opportunist who had taken advantage of his grief and vulnerability. The plan was perfect. In a matter of weeks, Clara Evans would be just another unpleasant memory the Ashworth family would prefer to forget. Meanwhile, on the 3rd-floor terrace, Clara and Arthur still held each other under the moonlight, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. For a few precious minutes, they were just a man and a woman in love, free from painful pasts and uncertain futures. But the illusion of safety was about to be shattered. Powerful forces were already moving in the shadows, determined to separate two souls who had found in each other the possibility of healing and redemption. The war had begun, and Clara was about to discover that when you fight against the established elite, even true love may not be enough to secure victory. The first bomb exploded on a March morning, while Clara was organizing the private library on the second floor. Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth arrived without warning, like a hurricane dressed in Chanel carrying decades of authority in her gaze. At 72, the family matriarch was a woman of impeccable posture and a sharp tongue, who had built her power through decades of social manipulation and emotional blackmail. "Amelia," she said, as she swept into the manor as if she were a queen inspecting her domain, "we need to talk, now." Clara heard the voices from the main hall and instinctively hid behind the bookshelves. Something in the older woman's voice made her feel like a child about to be punished for a crime she hadn't committed. "Mrs. Ashworth," Amelia replied with exaggerated reverence, "what a pleasure to have you. We weren't expecting—" "Of course you weren't expecting me," the matriarch cut in. "That's precisely why I'm here. To see with my own eyes what's happening in this house while my son pretends to lead this family." From her hiding place in the library, Clara could hear every word. Her heart raced as she realized they were talking about her. "The situation is more serious than I imagined," Eleanor continued. "A housemaid seducing my son, an orphan of dubious reputation, taking advantage of his fragility. This is unacceptable." "I agree completely," Amelia said. "I've tried to subtly warn Mr. Ashworth, but he seems blind to her intentions." "Blind or pathetic," the matriarch snarled. "Vivian has been dead for 2 years and he's still not over it. Any woman who shows him the slightest attention can manipulate him. But this time it has gone too far." Nausea rose in Clara's throat. Was that how they saw her? As a calculating opportunist taking advantage of Arthur's pain? As a predator who had planned everything from day one? "I've brought some interesting information," Amelia said with poorly disguised malice. The new driver, Mark, knew Clara from the orphanage where she grew up. According to him, the girl was always problematic. She made up fantastic stories, leveled false accusations against respected staff members. He even kept some letters she wrote back then, very revealing letters about her true personality. "Excellent," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "And what about her family?" "Any information on her origins?" Amelia hesitated for a moment. "Actually, I discovered something interesting about Clara's mother. Maria Evans worked here in this house about 25 years ago. She was dismissed under improper circumstances." Clara froze. Her mother had worked at Ashworth Manor. How was that possible? Why had she never known? "Interesting," the matriarch murmured. "Continue." "Well," Amelia said, clearly savoring the moment, "it seems Maria Evans had an affair with the late Mr. Robert Ashworth, Arthur's father. She became pregnant and was thrown out of the house to avoid a scandal." Clara's world collapsed. If her mother had an affair with Arthur's father, that would mean they were half-siblings. The love she had found, the first and only true love of her life, was impossible for reasons she couldn't even imagine. "Are you suggesting that Clara might be my late husband's daughter?" Eleanor's voice was laced with venom. "It's a possibility that must be investigated," Amelia said cautiously. "If it's true, it would explain why she feels so at home here. Why she managed to seduce Arthur so easily. It would almost be genetic." Clara had to hold on to the bookshelf to keep from falling. The revelation was like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless. Everything she had believed in, all the love she had allowed to blossom in her heart, was being destroyed by cruel words based on malicious assumptions. "Arrange a DNA test," Eleanor ordered coldly. Discreetly. "And in the meantime, I want this person removed from this house immediately." "On what pretext?" Amelia asked. "Make one up. Theft, insubordination, anything. Just get her out of here before she does any more damage to our family's reputation." Clara couldn't listen anymore. Running silently down the service stairs, she reached her room with a shattered heart. It all made sense now. The strange recognition in Arthur's eyes when he saw her mother's photograph, the way she sometimes felt oddly familiar in that house, as if she belonged there somehow. But if she was really Arthur's half-sister, then what they felt for each other was wrong, immoral, impossible. And even if it wasn't, the women downstairs had already decided her fate. She would be thrown out, humiliated, publicly destroyed. Tears began to fall as Clara picked up her small suitcase and started packing her few belongings. She wouldn't wait for the public humiliation. She would leave on her own terms, preserving at least her dignity. It was as she was folding her mother's photograph to put in the suitcase that she noticed something she had never seen before. On the back of the image, besides the name Maria Evans, 1975, there was an address written in faint pencil. 247 Acacia Street, Leavenshoom. Clara frowned. Why had her mother written down that address? Was it where she lived when the photo was taken? Or was it somewhere important to her? A desperate idea formed in her mind. If she was leaving anyway, if her life in that house was over, she would at least find out the truth about her mother. Maybe, just maybe, she would find answers that could change everything. Tucking the photograph into her coat, Clara finished packing. She would go down the service stairs, leave through the back of the property and never return. She wouldn't say goodbye to Arthur because she wouldn't know how to explain, how to tell him that their love might be based on a biological impossibility. But as she reached the first floor, she heard Arthur's voice coming from the main drawing room. He had arrived home from work and was clearly surprised by his mother's presence. "Mother, what a surprise! You didn't tell me you were coming. Do I need to give notice to visit my own son?" Eleanor's voice was thick with disapproval. "Of course not. It's just, is there a special reason for your visit?" There was a tense pause, and Clara could imagine the matriarch carefully choosing her words to cause maximum impact. "Yes, there is. I've come to protect you from yourself. I've come to save our family's reputation before it's too late." "What are you talking about?" Arthur's voice was growing tense. "I'm talking about your housemaid, Clara Evans. I know about you two, Arthur. I know about the intimacies that have been happening under this roof." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara imagined the look on Arthur's face, surprise, anger, perhaps even relief at not having to hide anymore. "How dare you?" he began. "How dare I what? Protect my family? Stop you from destroying everything your father built because of a whim with a maid?" "It's not a whim," Arthur said in a controlled but fierce voice. "I love her." "Love her?" Eleanor laughed bitterly. "You don't even know her past. You don't know what kind of person she really is. You don't know that your precious Clara has a history of false accusations, of manipulation, of—" "Stop," Arthur interrupted. "I will not allow you to speak of her that way." "And you don't know the most interesting part," the matriarch continued, ignoring her son's warning. "Her mother worked in this house. She had an affair with your father. Clara could be your half-sister, Arthur. You could be in love with your own sister." The silence that followed was like a death sentence. Clara could hear the sound of something breaking, maybe a glass or a vase that Arthur had dropped. "That's impossible," he said finally, but his voice was filled with doubt. "It's possible and probable," Eleanor said triumphantly. "I've already arranged for a DNA test. In a few days we'll have confirmation." Clara couldn't listen anymore. The pain in her chest was so intense she could barely breathe. Heedless of the noise, she ran down the main staircase and out the front door, her suitcase banging against her leg with every step. The cold March air of Manchester hit her face like a slap, but she didn't stop running. She ran down the tree-lined street past the iron gate, ran until she couldn't run anymore, until her lungs screamed for mercy. When she finally stopped, she was in a park a few blocks from the manor, sitting on a bench under a century-old tree, trying to process what had happened. Her entire life had collapsed in a matter of minutes. The man she loved could be her brother. Her reputation was being shredded by lies, and she was once again alone in the world, with nowhere to go. It was then that she remembered the address on the back of the photograph, 247 Acacia Street. It was a clue, perhaps the only one she had to discover the truth about her origins. With the little money she had saved, Clara took a bus to the Leavenshoom neighborhood. The address led her to a simple but well-kept house with a small garden full of colorful flowers. A grey-haired lady was watering the plants when she approached. "Excuse me," Clara said shyly. "I'm looking for information about a woman who might have lived here many years ago. Maria Evans." The lady looked up and Clara saw immediate recognition. "Good heavens," the woman whispered. "You're the spitting image of her. You're Clara, aren't you?" Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "You knew my mother?" "Knew her?" The lady laughed through the tears that began to well up. "Darling, Maria was my daughter. I'm your grandmother." The world stopped again, but this time in a different way. Clara had found family. She had found someone who knew her before she was born, someone who held memories of her mother she had never heard. "My name is Rose," the lady said, opening her arms. And you, my dear granddaughter, you're home." As Clara lost herself in the first family hug she had received in almost 20 years, she didn't know that her grandmother held secrets that would change everything. Secrets about Maria Evans, about Clara's true father, and about a hidden will left by a young wife named Vivian, who had recognized the injustices of the past and tried to correct them. The truth was about to come out, and with it, the possibility that the love between Clara and Arthur was not impossible, just improbable enough to be worth fighting for. Rose Evans's house smelled of cinnamon and motherly love. Sitting in the small but cozy living room, sipping tea from delicate porcelain cups that seemed like family heirlooms, Clara listened to the story her grandmother told with tears in her eyes and a voice thick with emotion. "Your mother, Maria, was the most precious thing I had," Rose said, holding Clara's hands in hers. "Beautiful, intelligent, a dreamer. When she got the job at Ashworth Manor, we thought it was a blessing, a chance for her to have a better future." "And what happened?" Clara asked, though part of her feared the answer. Rose sighed deeply as if about to reveal a secret she had kept for decades. "Maria fell in love, but not with Mr. Robert Ashworth, as they are saying. She fell in love with the gardener, a young English lad named John Stevens." Clara felt as if the floor was shifting beneath her feet. "The gardener?" John was a good, hard-working, honest man. He and Maria met in the manor gardens, and it was love at first sight. They married in secret in a small chapel here in the neighborhood. I was their witness." Rose stood up and went to an old cabinet, from which she took a wooden box. Inside were yellow documents, photographs, and a marriage certificate. "Here," she said, showing the document to Clara. "Maria Evans Stevens, married to John Stevens on December 15th, 1974. Clara studied the paper in disbelief. But then, why did they leave the manor? Why did she die poor and alone? Rose's face darkened. Because they were found out. The housekeeper at the time, a terrible woman named Carmen, reported them to the family. She said Maria was stealing, that she was a bad influence on the other staff. John was fired immediately, and Maria was too. And then they came to live here with me. John found work at a garden center in town. They were happy, even with little money. But then Maria got pregnant and the complications started early." Rose paused to wipe away her tears. "John died in a work accident just before you were born. A lawnmower engine exploded. Maria was devastated. The shock sent her into premature labor." Clara's chest tightened. Her family history was even more tragic than she had imagined. "She survived the birth, but she never fully recovered," Rose continued. "She developed an infection the doctors couldn't cure. She only lived for a few years after you were born. Always sick, always struggling. Before she died, she made me promise to take care of you. Then why—" Clara could barely speak. "Why did I go to an orphanage?" Rose looked down in shame. "Because I was sick too. Severe diabetes, heart problems. I was in no condition to care for a small child. The church-run orphanage promised you'd receive a good education, love, a chance at a better future. I tried to visit when I could, but they always made excuses, said you were fine and that it would be better if I didn't interfere with your adjustment." Clara began to understand. Her grandmother had been deceived, manipulated by a system that separated families under the pretext of protection. "I tried several times to get you back," Rose said desperately, "but when I finally got my finances and health in order, they told me you'd been transferred to another home. I could never find out where." They cried together for a few minutes, mourning all the lost years, all the Christmases they could have spent together. All the family stories Clara should have grown up hearing. "But there's something else," Rose said finally. "Something that might change the situation between you and that Ashworth young man." Clara looked up with renewed interest. 3 months ago, a young lady came to see me. Blonde, elegant, said her name was Vivian Ashworth. She asked about Maria, about you, about the whole story. Clara's blood ran cold. "Vivian, Arthur's wife. But she died 2 years ago." "No," Rose said, shaking her head. "This woman was alive and well, dear. She came here late last year. She said she had discovered the injustices committed against our family and wanted to do the right thing." Clara no longer understood anything. If Vivian was alive 3 months ago, then the whole story about her death in Paris was a lie. But why? Rose went to the cabinet again and took out a sealed envelope. "She left me this. Said to give it to you personally if you ever showed up here." With trembling hands, Clara opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and some official documents. "Dear Clara," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means you have found your grandmother and discovered the truth about your family. My name is Vivian Ashworth, and I have made many mistakes. But I hope I can correct them with this letter." Clara read on, each word revealing a truth more shocking than the last. "I discovered by chance, while going through old files at the manor, what happened to your mother and father. The injustice was terrible. They were falsely accused of theft by my mother-in-law and the housekeeper at the time, who wanted to get rid of them because they disapproved of the interracial and class-crossing relationship." Clara stopped breathing. Injustice, false accusation. Her family had been destroyed by prejudice and cruelty. "I spent months investigating and found that your mother and John Stevens were legally married and that you are his legitimate daughter. There is no blood relation between you and the Ashworth family. My father-in-law never had an affair with Maria Evans. That is a lie created to harm her." Clara felt as if she were being brought back to life. She and Arthur were not siblings. Their love was not impossible or immoral. "As a form of reparation for the mistakes of the past," the letter continued, "I am leaving you 5% of the shares in the Ashworth Textile Company in my will. It is little compared to what your family lost, but I hope it is the start of a better life for you." Clara looked at her grandmother in disbelief. "She left me shares in the company." "Read the rest," Rose said with a mysterious smile. "There is one last thing you need to know. My marriage to Arthur was arranged by our families. We never truly loved each other, though we tried to build something together. In the last 2 years, I found my true love with another man, and Arthur deserves to find his as well. If that love is you, as I suspect it is after seeing you together discreetly, you have my blessing." Clara had to stop reading to process what she was hearing. Vivian had not only discovered the truth about her family, but had also noticed the connection between her and Arthur. "The hardest part of this letter," Vivian continued, "is to confess that I faked my own death to escape a marriage that was suffocating us both. The fire in Paris was real, but I was not in the hotel. I was with my beloved in another city. I allowed them to believe I had died because it was the only way to free Arthur from social conventions, without publicly destroying the family's reputation." Clara let the letter fall into her lap. Vivian was alive. She had faked her own death to free Arthur. All the grief, all the guilt he carried, was based on a well-intentioned lie. "She now lives in Portugal with the man she loves," Rose explained. "But before she left, she wanted to ensure that the injustices of the past were corrected and that you knew the truth about your origins." Meanwhile, at Ashworth Manor, Arthur was searching Clara's room like a desperate man. He had discovered she had left after overhearing the conversation with his mother, and the pain of their separation was worse than any grief he had ever felt. It was then that he found something that changed everything: Vivian's diary, which Clara had discovered but left behind in her haste to leave. Arthur read every page with growing disbelief, discovering that his wife had had an affair, that she planned to ask for a divorce, that... Looking for something specific. Mrs. Amelia's voice at the door made him turn sharply. "Where is Clara?" he asked bluntly. "She's gone," Amelia said with false sadness. "She left a letter saying she could no longer work here." "What letter?" "I haven't seen any letter." Amelia hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Arthur to realize she was lying. "Amelia," he said in a dangerously low voice, "where is Clara?" Before the housekeeper could answer, Mark appeared at the door. "Mr. Ashworth, I need to speak with you about Clara. There are things you need to know about her past." But Arthur was no longer interested in listening to lies. With Vivian's diary in his hand, he understood that his entire life for the past 2 years had been a sham. His wife was alive, his grief was unnecessary, and the woman he loved had left believing cruel lies. "Get out," he said, in a controlled but deadly voice. "Both of you, now." "Sir, you don't understand," Amelia tried. "Clara is dangerous. She—" "Get out!" Arthur exploded, his voice echoing through the manor's corridors. When he was alone in the room where Clara had slept for months, Arthur held the pillowcase that still carried her scent. He had lost the woman he loved because of lies and manipulation, but it wasn't too late. Vivian was alive, which meant he was free. And if Clara wasn't his sister, If that whole story was a farce created by cruel people, then he was going to find her and bring her home. The war was far from over. But now Arthur knew who his real enemies were, and they had underestimated how far a man in love would go to fight for the woman he loved. The truth had been revealed, and with it, the possibility that true love was stronger than any lie they could use to destroy it. Arthur drove through the streets of Manchester like a man possessed. It had taken him 3 days to track down the address he found on Clara's desk. 3 days of desperate investigation as the fragments of truth pieced themselves together in his mind, revealing a conspiracy deeper and crueler than he had ever imagined. Vivian's diary had been just the beginning. After that, Arthur discovered the forged documents Amelia had prepared to prove the affair between his father and Maria. Heavens! He found the secret bank accounts where Mark deposited money, received for special services of blackmail. He discovered that his own mother had orchestrated everything, using Amelia as her instrument to maintain control over the family. But the most devastating discovery was Vivian's true will, hidden in a safe deposit box she had rented, without anyone's knowledge. In it, his wife confessed everything. The loveless marriage, the affair she had found, the decision to fake her own death, to free them all from the suffocating social conventions. And most importantly, the provisions she made for the textile company shares destined for Clara Evans, as reparation for the injustices committed against her family. Now, standing before the simple house in the Levenshulme neighborhood, Arthur took a deep breath before knocking. He was as nervous as a teenager on a first date, but as determined as a warrior, about to fight for the life of the woman he loved. Rose answered the door with a warm smile that vaguely reminded him of Clara. "You must be Arthur," she said without surprise. "I was expecting you. You know who I am." "My granddaughter has spoken a lot about you," Rose said, inviting him in. "And from the look in her eyes when she said your name, I knew sooner or later you would come for her." Clara was in the back garden, helping her grandmother tend to the flowers Maria had planted years before. When she saw Arthur appear at the door, she dropped the watering can she was holding. "How did you find me?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. "I searched until I did," he said simply. "We need to talk." Clara looked at her grandmother, who discreetly retreated into the house, leaving them alone in the garden perfumed by the roses, blooming as autumn approached. "There's nothing to talk about," Clara said, avoiding his gaze. "Your mother was right. We're from different worlds, and My mother lied," Arthur interrupted. "About everything. About your parents, about your origins, about us being siblings. All of it was a lie." Clara looked at him for the first time since he had arrived. "What do you mean?" Arthur pulled a copy of Maria and John Stevens's marriage certificate from his pocket. "Your parents were married legally. You are the daughter of John Stevens, the English gardener, not my father. We are not siblings, Clara. We never were." Clara's legs felt weak. She leaned against the garden bench as she processed the information. "And there's more," Arthur continued. "Vivian is alive." "I know," Clara whispered. "She came here. She left a letter explaining everything." "Then you know I'm free," he said, approaching her slowly. "You know that everything I felt, everything I feel for you is real and possible." Clara looked up and he saw tears shining in her eyes. "But the things Mark said about me, the letters he has, lies and manipulation," Arthur said with conviction. "I've spoken to lawyers, investigators. Mark has a history of blackmail and abuse. The letters you wrote were from a traumatized teenager, being manipulated by a predator. No one who truly knows you would believe those forgeries. And your family, society, the class difference between us?" Arthur knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "I don't care about any of that. I only care about you, about what we have together, about the possibility of building a life based on true love, not on the conventions that destroyed our parents." Clara looked into his green eyes and saw the same determination she had seen the night they first kissed. But she also saw something more, a freedom that wasn't there before, the awareness of a man who had broken free from the chains of the past and was ready to create his own future. "I love you," she said finally. "Despite everything that's happened, despite all the fear, I love you." "Then come home with me," he said, "not as a maid, but as my equal, as the woman who will help me turn that cold manor into a real home." Before Clara could answer, they heard the sound of several cars arriving on the street. From the living room window, Rose shouted, There are a lot of people pulling up. Arthur stood up, his face hardening. My family. They've come for me. Indeed, Eleanor had arrived with Amelia, Mark, and 2 lawyers, determined to separate her son from the opportunistic Maid once and for all. As they entered the garden, the matriarch looked like an offended queen ready to execute unfaithful subjects. Arthur, this farce is over, she said imperiously. You will come home right now and put an end to this scandal. The only scandal here, Arthur said, placing himself protectively in front of Clara, is the lies and manipulation you used to try to destroy an innocent woman. Innocent? Mark stepped forward with a cruel smile. Hasn't she told you about the letters she wrote to me? About how she tried to seduce me when she was a minor? Rose, who had heard everything from the kitchen door, could no longer stay silent. You lying scoundrel, she shouted, emerging from the house with a hunting rifle in her hands. Get off my property before I do something I'll regret. Rose, no, Clara cried, but her grandmother was already pointing the gun at Mark. This man abused my granddaughter when she was a helpless child, Rose said, her voice trembling with rage. Then he spent years blackmailing her with letters a traumatized girl wrote apologizing for what he did to her. I won't let him continue to destroy our family. Eleanor recoiled, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control. Amelia, do something, she whispered. But Amelia was looking at Arthur with an expression of desperation. She knew her game was over, that all her lies were being exposed. Mr. Ashworth, she tried one last time. Mrs. Vivian is alive and well in Portugal, Arthur said coldly. And she left a very interesting will that my lawyers are currently reviewing. A will that not only proves the innocence of Clara and her family, but also documents your involvement in a conspiracy to commit fraud and blackmail. The silence that followed was broken only by the chirping of birds in the trees surrounding the house. Mark began to back away toward the cars, realizing his position was untenable. This isn't over, Eleanor muttered, but her voice no longer held its former authority. You're right, Arthur said. It isn't over. It's going to get better, because I'm going to marry Clara, and together we will transform the company into one that honors the memory of honest workers like John Stevens, who were wronged by the arrogance and prejudice of this family. Clara looked at him in surprise. It was the first time he had mentioned marriage, but the way he said it sounded like the most natural thing in the world. Marry me, he said, turning to her and completely ignoring the other's presence. Marry me and help me build a life where love is more important than social conventions. Yes, Clara said, the tears finally falling freely. Yes, I'll marry you. As they kissed there in the garden, with the roses perfuming the air and the golden late afternoon light bathing everything, it was as if the entire world conspired to celebrate that moment of true love's triumph over cruelty and manipulation. 6 months later, Ashworth Manor was completely transformed. The cold walls now displayed family photographs that included Rose Evans in a place of honor. The maid's room on the 3rd floor had become a library, filled with Clara and Arthur's favorite works. The garden, now tended by a team of gardeners hired in honor of John Stevens, bloomed with colors the property had never seen. Clara wore the wedding dress that had belonged to her mother, lovingly restored by Rose. Arthur stood beside her at the altar of the small chapel where Maria and John had married decades before, closing a circle of justice and redemption that seemed to have been drawn by fate itself. Among the guests were employees from the textile company, neighbors from Levenshume, and even a few remorseful members of Manchester's elite who had realized that true love was more valuable than any social convention. Amelia had been dismissed and was facing charges for document forgery. Mark had fled the city, but not before Clara gave a formal deposition about the abuse she had suffered, ensuring that other girls would not endure the same trauma. Eleanor, isolated in her Cotswolds mansion, had been forced to accept that her reign of manipulation had come to an end. When the priest asked if Clara took Arthur to be her husband, her voice was firm and full of conviction. I do, she said, forever. And when Arthur promised to love and protect Clara in all of life's circumstances, he looked into her eyes and saw reflected there not only the love they felt for each other, but also the promise of a new generation of Ashworths that would be built on pillars of justice, compassion, and equality. Their first Christmas as a married couple was celebrated at the manor, But this time the house was full of life, music, and joy. Clara no longer cried alone in the maid's room. Now she laughed with the family she had built, in the place she could finally call home. And when a gentle snow began to fall over Manchester, one of those rare occasions when winter surprised the city, Clara and Arthur held each other on the main balcony, watching the white flakes dance over the gardens where their family's story had begun so many years before. "I'm not afraid of the silence anymore," Clara whispered. "Why not?" Arthur asked, kissing her forehead. "Because now, when everything is quiet," she said, smiling, "all I hear is love." The manor that had for so long been a mausoleum of empty traditions and silent suffering had finally become what it was always meant to be, a home where two wounded souls had found healing in each other, and where true love had proven to be stronger than any force that tried to destroy it. The silence that now inhabited those corridors was no longer heavy with pain, but soft with contentment. And in the rooms where lonely cries once echoed, now resonated whispers of love and promises of a future built on the solid foundation of truth, justice, and the courage to fight for what truly matters. Clara Evans Ashworth had finally found her place in the world, and Arthur had learned that true power comes not from money or social